Okay, welcome friends to Holy Land Connection session, and our discussion for the week is going to be another interesting topic. As you noticed, that we've been unpacking the identity and the history and the heritage of the Arab Christians. So we moved along right now to the depth to unpack the complexity of the Palestinian Christians in the Holy Land, in Israel and Palestine. We discussed who are the Arab Christians, and we went back way to pre-Islam, to the first, second century. And we discussed with Dr. Alex Miller, who's going to join me in this session, and we're going to talk about the Palestinian Christians. Dr. Alex, thank you for joining me again.
I'm happy to be here.
I would like to start, for you, if you want to give us a catch up from the last discussion, because you start talking about the terminology that the Palestinians, and you were talking about the Philistines in the Old Testament, and then we moved along with our discussions to the Palestinians, to the nationality of Palestinians in our days. If you just give us a recap, that'd be great for our viewers.
Sure. Yeah, the name Palestine, in terms of a place name, is very, very ancient. I mean, even way before the Hebrews or Israelites even entered into Canaan. So this is a really ancient place name. But it normally, at least in the 20th century, and okay, in the Bible, it's related to a people group called the Philistines, and they were present around what is today Gaza, the Gaza Strip, that kind of area. But today, when we talk about Palestine, we're really talking about, and historically, after the Philistines, after the Old Testament period, we really are talking about an area or a region. So historically, Palestinians were people who just lived in Palestine. It's like saying, I'm a Texan. That doesn't really necessarily tell you anything about your ethnicity. You could be an Arab Texan, or a white Texan, or a Latino Texan, or a Korean Texan, but it just shows you kind of what part of the land you're in. So, and again, today we're not used to talking about it like this, but historically you could talk about Palestinian Jews. And we have examples of, historical writings. There's a European guy, and he's during the Ottoman Empire, and he's like, oh, I was on a train with a Russian Jew and a Palestinian Jew and a French priest, and da, da, da. So for a long time, Palestinians, until pretty recently, Palestinian just referred to people who happened to be there. You could be a Palestinian Armenian, you could be an Arab Palestinian, you could be a Palestinian Circassian. It just meant that you were from that chunk of land, what is today Israel, Palestine, in terms of political borders.
Speaking about land and boards, let us now go back to the first century. Did the Romans actually call Palestina?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. A lot of different empires would use that that term in terms of calling it that area, Palestine. And we also have examples. I think the Byzantine Empire, they would use that name sometimes, and then also, of course, the Ottoman Empire, they would also use that. They would also use that phrase or that name to refer to that chunk of their empire. So yeah, I mean, this has been a name for a chunk of land that's been used off and on for well over 2,000 years.
So it's a term used for land, not a nationality.
That is correct. I mean, historically, that's the way it is. Just like with Arabs, we talked about Arabs at one point in time, in some usages, it just refers to a way of life, nomadic people. It's not ethnicity or linguistic at all. But today we use it in a different way. It's the same thing with Palestinian. For a long time, Palestinian didn't really tell you anything about the ethnicity of a person, but it told you where they came from, what part of the earth they came from.
Okay.
And that's different than today, of course.
So let's try to go through this kind of period of time, all the way from the Romans. They called this land Palestine, and we're talking about the land itself. We're not talking about nationality. That means there's different people groups that were living throughout the centuries, beginning with the Romans, even to like late 19th century. Different, as you mentioned, were there. That means there are different ethnicities and different people groups, such as.
Well, yeah, we have a lot of different people groups because remember that this chunk of land, Israel-Palestine, we call that Israel-Palestine today, is at that kind of meeting at the crossroads of Asia, Europe, and Africa. So
Yeah.
even though it's a small chunk of land, it's very strategic, it just in terms of location. So who are the different people we had there? Well, you have all these different Semitic peoples. Of course, Arabs are Semitic peoples and Jews are Semitic peoples. As you know, Hebrew and Arabic, they resemble each other in many different words and phrases as well. Sounds, the alphabets overlap very significantly and so on. So who are the different peoples that we're going to find there? Well, we're going to find Greeks. Okay, so like one day I was walking along the old city of Jaffa, and a friend of mine was like, "Can you believe that this was all built by the Arabs and then it was taken away by the Jews?" And I said, "No, this wasn't built by Jews or Arabs. This was built by Greeks, because it was the waterfront, you know, the really ancient stuff." And he's like, "Oh, yeah, I guess that's right." So you're going to have the Greeks, you're going to have the Romans. Now the Romans, I don't think that many of them actually moved there and stayed there. So Pontius Pilate, of course, he's Roman, but that was not a great position to have in the Roman Empire. You know, that was like not the job that you wanted. If you got stuck in Palestine, then you know you would be there for a while and you would kind of do what you had to do so you could get a promotion and leave. That was not a choice position. You have a lot of these other people groups that are left over and that kind of interbred with the Jews and later the Arabs. These would be people groups that you've heard of, the Midianites and the Edomites and so on. They didn't just vanish. They didn't just totally cease to exist. But they did what people do throughout history. You know, they intermarried and so on. So when you meet Arabs or Jews today who have roots that go back a long ways, there's a good chance that they have some of that ancestry. You know, the Midianites, the Edomites, the Amalekites, and all those Old Testament people groups. So you have the Greeks. The Persians came in, but I don't think that there's much Persian ancestry. They weren't there for a very long time. The Crusaders, they came in. They were there in the 11th, 12th century, that period of time. And but a lot of them didn't stay. They came, and you know, the Crusades, those were, maybe we could do a whole session on the Crusades. That's an important period of history. They established the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, and not many of them stayed, but some of them did stay. Some of those Europeans who came from England and, you know, Northern Europe, you know, very fair skinned, some of my ancestry maybe, from Denmark and Germany, you know, and some of them stayed. So as you know, you can go to Bethlehem and you'll see people who are Arabs, you know, would identify themselves as Palestinian Arabs, but who have these blue eyes or red hair, and you're like, what's this from?
Yeah.
And of course, there's two people groups that still exist today. They're fairly small, but we're talking about the Armenians and the Circassians. The Circassians are from the Caucasus region. That's what Circassian means. It means they're from the Caucasus. So they tend to be very fair-skinned people. Some of them are blonde. You'll see people with green eyes and blue eyes. Not all of them. And this is, at least in Israel, this is a Muslim people group. But wrap your brain around this. This is a Muslim people group, and their day-to-day first language is Hebrew. So that's just a reality. And they have, like, I think 2 or 3 villages there in Israel. The Armenians, of course, that's also a small community, but with very deep historical roots. And as you know, one of the 4 quarters in Jerusalem, the old city, is called the Armenian Quarter, where they have the Cathedral Church of St. James. So there's a lot more than Arabs and Jews. People think, oh, it's just Arabs and Jews, but there's so much more historically. And even today, there is a lot of variety. Oh, you also have Copts. So
Yeah.
these are people who came from Egypt.
And Syria.
Some of them were soldiers during the Ottoman period, and they settled there. So that's why you have like a Coptic church, as you know, right there in Nazareth.
And remember, there's also Maronites right now
Mm-hmm.
in Syrian.
Mm-hmm.
And so we talk about diversity itself within the several denominations of Palestinian Christians throughout history that they still exist actually in the land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you want to talk about the different denominations that exist there today?
Yeah, that's what that's the flow that we went throughout history. Really brief. We can talk about the Ottomans, and then the British Mandate, and then the establishment of the state of Israel, and what happened with the Palestinian Christians. But it's just kind of broad topic. But
Mm-hmm.
we've seen that there is that kind of complexity of denominations on the historical churches, and we talked about Palestinian Christian bishops and several councils in the early centuries, and we've seen the heritage throughout the first session that we talked about. But if you want to say something about that kind of mosaic of Palestinian Christians that they still today exist, what's the uniqueness of their existence throughout centuries, and how, I mean, and even the conflicts that happened, and the people groups that they came into the land, the empires that they came to the land, like Muslims, for example. How did they keep on
Mm-hmm.
living in this land?
Sure. Well, yeah, I mean, the seminal or the key event in terms of after the biblical period is going to be the Islamic conquest. You know, the Crusades, people make a big deal out of the Crusades today, but when the Crusades actually happened, we know from Muslim historical sources, it was like, oh, it's Palestine. That's not, Mecca, not Medina. That's not Damascus. That's not Baghdad. That's kind of, it's kind of in the backyard. Who really cares about that? The Muslims at the actual time of the Crusades didn't think that it was an incredibly important thing. And Saladin, when he was trying to raise an army and call people to jihad to get back Palestine, a lot of people were like, yeah, we're just not very interested in that. We don't think it's very important. But so there's a big difference with the Crusades between the actual history of actually what happened and how people think about those and talk about those today. But the real key event then is going to be what's called Futuh al-Bilad, which is a nice Islamic way of saying the opening of the nations. Although in actual history, and I teach church history and religious history, we call it the Islamic conquests.
Mm-hmm.
And they came, they laid siege to Jerusalem. Muslims will tell you, we took this over without fighting. Well, I guess technically that's true, but they also starved probably thousands of people to death by sieging Jerusalem, by not letting food and water, go into the city and so on. But they did. They laid siege to Jerusalem, and they were able to take over that city. And, Islam, when it first arrived, it was very strongly identified with the Arab people. That's something that you get in the Quran that's really emphasized. Here's an Arab prophet, here's a book that's not in Hebrew, not in Greek, it's in Arabic. So that was a big kind of emphasis of the early Islamic conquest. And they didn't force people to convert. That's also, at least in Palestine, that's also a common misconception.
Exactly. That's what I wanted to focus on. That there's a lot of misconceptions that when Muslims were there in this land, that they try to force by sword for people to convert.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, a lot of the times, the Muslim Arabs would go and take over, and they were extremely successful. I mean, they expanded that empire incredibly quickly. I mean, it's very unprecedented historically to see such a large empire established so quickly, and there's a lot of historical reasons for that. I won't get into that now. But in the system, in the Islamic system, the way of running a society, you have what are called dhimme, or in English we usually pronounce it dhimmi, but really, as you know, the proper Arabic is dhimme. And under the Turks, this was the millet, or the millet system. And this was a way of kind of segregating Christians and Jews, and then later other religions too, so that they would have their own communities, they would have their own neighborhoods, they would have their own way of dressing, they would have their own languages. And then the Muslim ruler would basically say, okay, you have your thing, you're a dhimme, you're a dhimmi, so what you need to do is you have to pay a special tax. That's called the jizya, that's Jizya, and that is explicitly commanded in the Quran, so that you can't get out of the jizya by saying, oh, that's later Islamic, whatever. No, that's explicitly commanded in the Quran. You have this special tax that the non-Muslims must pay, the people of the book have to pay. a lot of Christians are like, oh, we're people of the book. Like, that's a wonderful thing. People of the book is not necessarily positive when you read the Quran. The people of the book mean, okay, well, they're not atheists and they have a book, but, you know, they're second-rate citizens because they don't accept Muhammad the Prophet. You know, so people of the book is not really a compliment when you get into the Quran, as you probably know. Now, so this dhimmi system, it was a real incentive to not accept converts, because once these Christians and Jews, once they converted to Islam, then they didn't have to pay the jizya. So the Muslim rulers, I mean, they liked having these large Christian and Jewish populations because they had to pay this extra tax. So when you have like a lot of these people in North Africa converting to Islam, they were not usually excited about that. They, you know, the Muslims, they wanted to rule, but there were times when you had Muslim rulers, and like in Anatolia, or what's today Turkey, you know, you could have 80% of the population that was Christian.
Yes.
So that's another misconception. People say, oh, dhimmi, those are religious minorities. No, no. A dhimmi is anyone who is not a Muslim who's living under Muslim control. So, I mean, today, if Barack Obama became Muslim, although actually according to the Sharia he is, because his dad was Muslim, but we won't go there. Then everyone in the United States who's not a Muslim would become dhimmi. You know, that's just how the Sharia works.
Yeah. So that was really a great point, that throughout even Muslim rulers, like when you talked about the Ottomans and they were there, that points that even Palestinian Christians, they were minorities, and even second and sometimes citizens throughout centuries. And that's something that this minority kind of already got used to it throughout centuries in this part of the world, this region, in this cradle of Christianity, despite that their heritage is way back to the early centuries. And even when the British Mandate came and the establishment of the State of Israel, they kept on, you know, carrying this load and burden of being a minority within a minority and being second and third class citizens, because we all recall what happened when the State of Israel was established in 1948. I mean, some left and some stayed in their villages. I know my dad, who was born in 46, he stayed in his village, and of course his grandfathers and his ancestors can trace their heritage long back in time about their existence. But I want to ask you to that kind of to our days. So Palestinian Christians in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. And we all know that as a minority status, they're considered second and third class citizens. What is their uniqueness of being in this land in those decades of conflict within the small country?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And I spent some time just in the West Bank a couple of years ago, just going around and talking to different Christians, both lay people and leaders. And I was in Jenin, Jericho, Nablus, Bethlehem, Ramallah. I mean, all the major cities except for Hebron, which Hebron or Khalil doesn't really have hardly any Christians to begin with. So, and this was one of the questions that I would ask. The main answer that they gave, and this is in the West Bank, so this is going to maybe be a little bit different answer than like an Israeli-Palestinian, which I know sounds weird to people, but you know what I mean when I say Israeli-Palestinian. They said that, you know, we just have this connection. We have this connection to the land. There have always been Christians here, and they're you know, the Christian population here cannot die out. Because, and this is where I was going with talking about the dhimmi system, a lot of Christians did become Muslims. You know, that's just historically what happened. To the point where, you know, Bethlehem, as you know, was a majority Christian city. It's not anymore. Nazareth, until recently, was a majority Christian city. It's not anymore. Jerusalem, for a long time, was a majority Christian city, and now it's just a tiny Christian minority in Jerusalem. You know, to the point where, you know, you have one village, which is an actual Christian village in the West Bank that's entirely Christian, Taibe. So, yeah. When I asked this question, that was really the answer that I got, though, is that we have this tie, like who we are as people and our identity, our spirit, is tied to this piece of land. This piece of land is not like any other part of the world. This is the land where Jesus and the apostles were active, where they were doing ministry, where Jesus did miracles. And if we were to emigrate, which, as you know, so many Palestinians, they leave. They go to Australia, Canada, Europe, USA, whatever, Latin America, some of them. If we were just to be totally gone, that would be the tragedy. That we would no longer have this tie to this land.
Do you think, speaking about this, this is a really good point I want to bring up as we're about to end up our session. From your point of view as a Western, and that this is a great point about, do you think within the misconceptions and misunderstandings who's a Palestinian Christian, within the context of the Arab-Israeli conflict, if it's the Palestinian Christians in Israel or in the West Bank and Gaza, do you think the Western mindset, if they keep on misunderstanding this minority's existence and importance to this country, do you think down the road those Palestinian Christians, it's like a pressure cooker, with all the difficulties and challenges, they might just leave. And churches and the history and the heritage for Christianity in the Holy Land, then later on it becomes like museums.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
what do you think?
Historically, that's already happened in a lot of places. I mean, that's sad. And everyone wants to think, especially Christians in the West, they always want to have this kind of victorious image of Christianity spreading and growing all the time. It doesn't. That's just not historically what has happened. There were great Christian churches in North Africa, and today they're gone. Turkey, Anatolia, was one of the heartlands of Christianity today. They're just, churches are just closed. There are whole cities that used to be entirely Christian, and today there's probably not a single Christian living there. So is that possible? It's absolutely possible. And a lot of the younger Christians, especially that I talked with, especially in the West Bank,
yeah,
they feel like they don't have any options. They don't feel like, they think, I could go to university, get a good degree, but I'm never going to get a good job. I'm never going to, be able to afford an apartment and get married and have a family. And, they just feel like that. And unfortunately, there's some validity to that point of view. And it's sad. But when I was in the West Bank, I would always have Christians saying, will you help me get a visa? I want to leave. That's sad. That's the reality. So yeah, is that possible? I hate to say it, but yeah, it certainly is possible. It's possible that the Holy Land someday would have no Christians, no indigenous Christians. There's always going to be Christian tourists and pilgrims, which is important, because that's actually one of the reasons, one of the main ways, as you know, that Christians in Israel, Palestine have work. Is by interacting with those pilgrims. So that stream of pilgrims is one of those things that makes that indigenous community able to continue existing, even if it's not a great existence all the time. So,
if you want to conclude this session, and what are the practical ways as an American Christian that lived there, you interacted, you broke bread, you knew this minority, what do you say to people that they're watching a session like this about those Palestinian Christians? What are the tips that you want to share about breaking those misconceptions or moving the veil of ignorance about this minority and about their importance in this country? And what are the practical ways people can get to know better this minority?
That's a great question. Well, the first thing that I would say is go to the West Bank and stay there. So many people, they go to Israel and they'll just spend time in Jewish cities. They'll be in Tiberias, they'll be in Jerusalem, maybe they'll go to Haifa. Go and stay in the Arab towns, go and stay in the Arab cities, stay in Nazareth. I just would get so frustrated because people would come through Nazareth, they'd get there in the morning, they go up to the Mount Precipice, Jabal al-Qafzi, they'd go to the Church of the Annunciation, and they'd go to the Mary's Well, and then they'd leave. I'm like, Why? Why do you stay here in Nazareth? You know, or I mean, even in Nazareth Elite, there's like a big hotel right there. You know, I mean, but just stay here in this area at least. And so that would be the first thing. And go to the West Bank, go to Ramallah, go to Nablus, go to Jenin. Yeah, okay, maybe some of the hotels are not as nice. Although Ramallah has great hotels.
It does.
I like Ramallah because it's also a lot cheaper than Israel. Um, so go to these places, stay there. Don't just visit during daytime hours and then leave. That would be the first thing I would say. And the second thing I would say is don't assume that you know everything about Christian-Muslim relations, or for that matter, Christian-Jewish relations. Go there and ask. You know, don't go there, because Americans, Westerners, they go there with this mind frame like the Christians are always suppressed and oppressed by the Muslims. Well, that's not true. But then others go there and they're like, oh, look how beautiful the Palestinians are. It doesn't matter if you're Christian or Muslim because you have this harmony. Well, that's also not true. Not always. You know, so you've got to go there and get, you know, just really get into the complexity of it. Same thing with Jewish-Christian relations. Sometimes they're very good. Sometimes they're very bad, but it's not always. Everything is gray. So get into the complexity. Don't be afraid of the complexity. Americans like everything, and you know, I guess Europeans to a lesser extent, very clear-cut and simple. Nothing is clear-cut. Nothing is simple. Okay, over there, embrace it. Get to know it. You know, so that would be my advice.
What do you think the Western Church can do practically to help those Palestinian Christians, especially at the issue of immigration? How can you keep on this youth, this important generation to survive there? Because you know, Alex, you've been there, and the biggest misconception is that, man, Palestinians, Arab-Israeli conflict, Palestinians, Muslims, terrorists, Hamas, Fatah, Jihad, Kitab al-Qassam, they're all, you know, radicals. But that kind of misconception overviewed. But they forget about the Palestinian Christians, and that whatever side in the Arab-Israeli conflict they take, they don't know, they're not aware that they're doing harm and damage to the existence of this minority, such as the youth already struggling with the economy and education, and they just want to leave. So, what is the best option? Just hang in there. What do you tell them? What as a church?
As a church, what I say is, okay, first of all, don't take people out. Because they do that all the time. They're like, oh, poor Palestinian, you know, let's give him a scholarship to the USA. I don't recommend that personally. But if you want to help someone, go over there and say, okay, we're going to do some seminars on how to run a business better. You know, listen and take what you want from it. But give them skills, help them to develop skills so that the young guy is like, wow, you know, I've learned a lot, and I think I can actually open my own business, which is not easy to do over there, but it can be done, and people do it all the time. Or, you know, help them to meet their own needs. You know, another thing that's a big problem in the West Bank is housing. So I love what different churches, you know, and actually the main church that's built housing is the Roman Catholic Church, which, as you know, numerically is not very big. Yep. But they saw these young families and these young people were like, we want to get married and have kids, but we don't have money because, you know, land over there is real expensive. Building stuff can be expensive too, but just getting the land is expensive and hard. And sometimes, I mean, you don't even know what chunk of land belongs to who because of the documents. It's complicated. So you know, they went over there and they built houses, or they built an apartment building. Like there's a couple in Bethlehem, one near Jerusalem. I think that's great because, and they were able to help. You know, we do this here in the States all the time, like Habitat for Humanity, which I'm sure you know you've heard of, and all of our listeners have heard of. But you know, you got to help people to help themselves, and I think the main two needs that I saw that drive young people to want to leave, it's a lack of housing and not being able to make a living. So you help address those issues, teach people skills so they can get a better job or they can open their own business, and also if there's a way to you know, build housing, which again, a number of churches have already done that. then then do it. That's one of those things that can keep people in the land, because I think it would be a real tragedy to see the Holy Land without any indigenous Christians in it. I would hate to see that.
Yeah, that's great, and that actually will wrap up our session on a practical level. And for next session, I would like really to discuss with you because your experience is there. I'd like to discuss, since we right now covered up the broader topic of who are the Arab Muslims. We covered up who are the Palestinian Christians. I would like to start unpacking the mosaic of Christians in the Holy Land, in Israel and Palestine, and what is this mosaic's mission?
Mm.
The Great Commission,
Great.
the gospel itself, started from there, from this country, from this land, from Jerusalem, from the city of light, the city of peace. And one of the people groups that heard this gospel, also Arabs, and the heritage of this commission got carried all throughout decades and centuries, as we talked about through a rich history. So for the next session, I would like to discuss with you, Dr. Alex, about the mosaic of Christianity in the Holy Land and its mission. And I hope our viewers that they're going to view this later on when it's going to be recorded and online, that they're going to be able to join us in a discussion. And I would like to encourage everybody that is going to watch this right now on our Google Plus channel. Please, if you have any inputs or feedback or comments, just put them down in the bottom tab, and would like to answer it. And of course, you can join our ministry's site, SALAMintheholyland.com, or our Facebook page, Salam in the Holy Land. I'm really thankful for Dr. For your insights. Thank you so much. Do you have any words you want to conclude with for today?
No, I think it's a great topic, though. I do want to say one thing. A lot of Westerners go over there and they're like, why aren't these Arab Christians or Palestinian Christians, why aren't they evangelizing Muslims? And that a lot of the reason for that, there's a number of reasons. One thing is because the American missionaries and European missionaries didn't do it, not very often at least. So the Christians who received that kind of tradition from them also don't do it. But one of the main reasons really is this heritage of being dhimmi or a dhimmi, because you could always convert to Islam, but a Muslim converting to Christianity, that's just against the Sharia. That's illegal. Like you can't do it. So I think that's also an important point to mention. I will say, though, that I've seen that changing, and maybe that would be something that we could do further on down the road, is talk about the Christians who come from a Muslim background in the Holy Land. Because there's not a whole lot of them, but I think
you never know.
Probably over 1,000. So,
yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Ronnie.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alex. Have a great weekend, and we'll catch up next week. Thank you so much to our viewers, and hope you catch up with us later on next week in our topic, the mosaic of Christians in the Holy Land and their mission over there. Hope you have a great and safe and warm week from Salam in the Holy Land. We tell you Salam al-Masih. God bless you all. Thank you.